A cold-hearted millionaire who once abandoned his blind daughter after a tragic accident he caused. A black laborer who lost his own daughter to a corrupt and filthy healthcare system. They had never met. They came from different worlds. There was no reason for their paths to cross. But one quiet afternoon, in the serene garden of a lavish mansion, that estranged father stood frozen watching his daughter smile for the first time in 2 years. Not because of money, not because of medicine, but because of a stranger gently feeding her spoonfuls of porridge while telling her about the color red in the sunset. He didn't know that her father was hiding in the shadows, witnessing everything, and he couldn't imagine that he was about to bring an entire empire of lies into the light, fueled only by the love of a father who had lost his child. This isn't just another touching story. It's a journey that exposes those in white coats who experiment on children's lives and how a blind little girl led 2 broken men back to who they truly were. If you've ever lost faith in medicine, in justice, or in humanity, watch until the very end, because light always begins in the darkest place. Evening settled gently over the quiet suburbs of northern New York. The last golden light of day touched each stone in the vast Mediterranean-style garden more than 2,000 square meters behind the mansion where James Whitaker had lived alone since the death of his wife. Everything here remained unchanged. The lavender bushes lining the walkway, the old piano lying silent in the living room. And yet, the atmosphere had shifted. It was cold and quiet. James stood in his second-floor study, his eyes unconsciously drawn to the large glass window. As usual, he had spent 14 hours glued to his computer spreadsheets, design plans, and a flood of emails. But this afternoon, his gaze stopped, startled by something he never expected to see. In the western corner of the garden, beside blooming rhododendrons, a black man in a worker's uniform, his shoes coated with dried mortar, was sitting next to his daughter. Emily, the 9-year-old girl with lifeless eyes, was listening intently and laughing. Laughing, truly. Not the forced smiles she gave when the therapists came, not the weary chuckle she mustered for the new nurse, but a light, bubbling laugh like the chime of wind bells in springtime. James froze. Since the accident, the night the car skidded off the cliff road in the rain, and darkness permanently claimed Emily's Scythe, hadn't heard that sound. She used to be the heart of the home, darting around in floral dresses and white bows, asking her mother, "Does green have a smell?" and giggling to every piano tune. But after the crash, the house had turned into a living tomb. James, the one behind the wheel that night, sank into silence. Emily, the one who bore the aftermath, sank into darkness. And now, she was laughing. For a stranger, he quietly stepped onto the balcony, fingers brushing the wrought iron railing. The breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. Below, the man James couldn't even recall his name was gently spoon-feeding Emily. Not like a worker serving a client, but like a father patient, tender enough to make anyone watching feel their chest tighten. Red is like the warmth of morning sunlight on your cheek. And purple, it's when you close your eyes and hear your mother play piano, sad but soft. The man's voice was warm and deep. This wasn't idle small talk. Every word seemed chosen with care, measured by feeling, memory, and profound understanding. Emily tilted her head, then slowly reached out and touched his face, uncertain but precise. "What's your name, sir?" "Chris. Chris Evans." "I'm Emily. I want to see the world through your eyes. Can I?" James felt like someone had slapped him square in the chest. Something inside burned. He had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on therapies, hired renowned doctors, music instructors, psychologists, but never had he heard Emily say something like that. His daughter had just called a stranger uncle and asked to see the world through him. James turned away and stepped inside, but his feet faltered. He leaned against the glass door, his chest tightening. For 2 years, he had avoided Emily. He couldn't look at her without seeing the blood on her face in that stormy night. He thought distancing himself was giving her space to heal. But the truth was running from himself. Emily lived with nurses, maids, and occasionally her grandmother, but she never asked for her father. And today, for the first time, she shone like a child who had never lost her sight. Not because of doctors, not because of miracles, but because of a man with cracked hands, a faded shirt, and a gentle smile like morning sunlight. A man James had never cared to ask about, never paid attention to, never imagined could teach him anything. And yet, that man had just taught him this. Light doesn't only come from the ice, it comes from those who know how to see with their hearts. A gust of wind suddenly scattered the stack of documents on James's desk. He stooped to gather the pages, but his mind was no longer in the room. Not in the office. Not in the multi-million-dollar contracts in Dubai or Chicago. But out there, where his daughter after 2 long years had just spoken the name of a color. James Whitaker used to be the poster child of a man who had it all. Business World magazine called him the giant of construction, the man who transformed industrial wastelands in Brooklyn into iconic developments. He was on television, traveled the world, and sat across from powerful figures. But behind that glamorous curtain, a colder, quieter, and far more painful reality lived. That reality began on a September evening 2 years ago. That day, James had just come out of a tense meeting about a redevelopment project in Seattle. Emily, then only 7, was in the back seat. His wife, Anna, had to attend a charity performance in Manhattan and had asked James to pick their daughter up from her music class. It was drizzling. James was driving while taking a call from a major investor in Dubai. The winding mountain road home was slick with mud. The SUV suddenly skidded just as he glanced down at his phone. The crash shattered the night. Airbags deployed. Everything turned to blur. When James opened his eyes, there was silence. He could smell burning rubber, hear the soft patter of rain. Emily sat motionless in the back seat, her face covered in blood. She wasn't crying. She only whispered, "Daddy, I can't see anymore." After the shock, James was no longer the same man. Doctors confirmed Emily had suffered severe damage to her optic nervure. Chances of recovery were virtually zero. Anna, already battling postpartum depression, completely broke down. Less than 3 months later, she died from a stroke on another rainy night in the very room where her piano still sat silently by the window. James said nothing at the funeral. He didn't cry. He didn't apologize. He just sat there, hands clenched on the armrest, as though he'd shatter into pieces if he let go. Afterward, he buried himself in work 18 hours a day. Emily's bedroom was locked. 2 nurses rotated shifts to care for her. One of them barely knew her birthday. James told himself he was working to secure Emily's future. But deep down, he knew that was a lie. The truth was, he was running away, running from those blind eyes that turned toward high eyes once bright with joy, now black holes that swallowed every emotion. He couldn't bear to hear Emily say his name without responding. Each time he passed her room, he sped up like a criminal fleeing the scene. Every night, James poured himself a glass of whiskey in the library, the only room that still held a trace of Anna. On the table sat a framed photo of the 3 of them, taken under maple trees during Emily's 5th autumn. That picture had become a symbol of a time forever lost. He used to think, "I lost everything in a single careless moment." But the truth was harsher. He didn't just loosely push away what little remained. Emily began to fall into a mild depression. She refused to meet with her piano teacher.
"I can't feel the music anymore if I can't see my hands playing,"
she said. Her favorite toys were cast aside. If someone touched her, she flinched like a wounded animal. Many times, James stood outside her door, his hand on the knob, wanting to go in, but he always backed away. He feared her. Gaze feared the silent forgiveness it might carry, because sometimes forgiveness hurts more than accusation. And so, time slipped by, until one day in April, a man with curly hair, a sturdy frame, and a warm voice sat in the garden that once held laughter, spoon-feeding his daughter. Chris Evans, the new worker hired to help restore the estate's garden. In just 2 weeks, Chris made Emily laugh-made, her ask about colors, tell stories from her past. He did what James, with all his power, money, and prestige, could not. James began watching them from the window. No interference, no words, just watching. At first, there was suspicion, then confusion, then a slow, aching pain like an old wound, reopening. Why did his daughter open up to a stranger so easily? How could she laugh with him without hesitation? And worst of all, how did this man know how to comfort Emily better than James, her own father? The answers weren't in any financial report. Not in the Zoom meetings with global stakeholders, and certainly not in the 100-page therapy plans he had commissioned from specialists. They lived in Emily's face every time she called Chris, and in the trembling silence of James himself, a man who once believed he was strong, yet no longer had the courage to reach out and touch his daughter's hand. James Whitaker was a man who lived by control. He could point a finger and have a billion-dollar project's design overhauled within 24 hours. A single stroke of his pen could change hundreds of lives for better or worse. To James, the world ran on clarity, spreadsheets, deadlines, strategy. Yet in just 2 weeks, a man with no visible credentials, no clear background, no social standing had silently walked into his daughter's world like someone who already knew every emotional code by heart. Chris Evans, a name that sounded entirely ordinary. But James didn't believe in ordinary. His business instinct and his father's instinct demanded a deeper look. Why did a bricklayer know how to describe colors through feelings? Why was he so unshakably patient with a blind child? And why? Why did Emily look at him with a trust James had never received? One early morning, while Emily was still asleep, James called Wallace, the head of security and his go-to man for sensitive matters. He didn't need to explain. Wallace understood instantly. You want a full background check. Clean, complete, including what doesn't show up online. I want everything, James said, especially any ties to children. With just 2 sentences, Wallace activated his private network retired cops, investigative journalists, social surveillance experts. Within 72 hours, a thick file landed in James's private email. Subject: Chris Evans, personal dossier. Chris D. Evans, 42 years old. Born in Atlanta, Georgia. Graduated with honors in civil engineering from Georgia Tech. Former chief engineer at Ellis and Roth Architecture, Boston, for over 8 years. Holder of a patent for seismic-resistant steel structures. Wife: Rachel Evans, deceased, 2015, pancreatic cancer. Daughter: Chloe Evans, deceased, 2017, terminal leukemia diagnosis. After his daughter's death, Chris resigned, sold his luxury apartment, and withdrew all savings. He has since lived in at least 6 different states over the past 5 years. No fixed address. Currently working part-time for NatureWorks, a boutique garden renovation company specializing in estate landscapes. No criminal record, but 2 police reports filed for trespassing at private medical research facilities in Boston. Both cases were dropped due to lack of evidence. James read every line as though his heart were being squeezed. An exceptional engineer. A man who lost his wife to illness, lost his daughter to cancer, then vanished from his professional world to become a gardener. But instead of easing James's suspicion, the information only deepened it. A man like that, with his intelligence, pain, and potential, couldn't just be playing with a blind girl in someone else's backyard for healing. No, he had to be searching for something. But what? And why Emily? Out of hundreds of mansions across New York, why was Chris assigned to this garden? Why did he appear at the exact moment James was at his weakest? And why did every conversation with Emily carry a strange undertone, like he was replacing something long lost? James closed the file, but his mind was spinning. He looked out the window. Chris was bent over, adjusting a garden hose near the fountain. Emily sat beside him, touching the petals of a flower with quiet concentration. Chris said something. Emily laughed. James's heart clenched. Then a voice came from the doorway. "Daddy?" Emily. She stood leaning against the doorframe, carefully feeling her way. Her face looked thinner, but the light in her voice made it hard for him to breathe. "I heard Uncle Chris in the garden. Would you like to come down with me?" James looked at his daughter. For the first time in 2 years, she had sought him out. Not because she needed something, not because she was in pain, but because she wanted to share something she loved. And he couldn't answer. A strange fear was tightening around his throat. Not fear that Chris would hurt his daughter, but fear that Emily might come to love him more. Fear of being replaced. Fear of losing the only role James had left, being a father. He forced a smile, gently resting a hand on Emily's shoulder. "You go ahead, sweetheart. I'll be down soon." Emily nodded, then slowly made her way along the hallway, her shoes brushing softly against the wooden floor. James turned back to his computer screen, but the data now looked like meaningless strings of numbers. He didn't know what was coming. But somewhere deep inside, a silent warning echoed. That man hasn't just entered your garden. He might be stepping into your daughter's heart with a kind of love you've long forgotten how to give. The next morning, James woke earlier than usual. He couldn't fall back asleep after a restless night, filled with thoughts of Chris. The image of Emily laughing in the garden, Chris's warm voice, the dossier filled with unanswered questions all lingered like cigarette smoke clinging to the lungs. James had never known fear. Not the fear of losing money or power, but the fear of losing the one thing still tethering him to this world, his daughter. As the first rays of sunlight slipped through the window, he sat in the library, a cup of coffee growing cold in his left hand, and Chris's file resting in his right. The sun hadn't yet risen fully, but outside, James could hear steady footsteps. Chris. No nurse, no assistant, no one else. Just two men, and something growing silently between them. Tension. James stepped into the yard, heading straight for the garden. Chris was trimming ivy. He looked up at the sound of footsteps. Not surprised. Not evasive. He simply nodded. "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker." James was silent for a few moments, then spoke. "I think it's time we had a conversation." Chris set down the shears, wiped his hands on the towel, tucked into his pocket, and stood up. His eyes weren't guarded, but they weren't fully open either. "I'm guessing this is about Emily?" James nodded. Then, in the calmest tone he could manage, said, "I know who you are, Chris. I've seen the file. About Chloe. About Rachel. About your break-in at Mount Clair Research Institute in 2018. Chris's face paused for a beat. Then he nodded slightly, as if it had been expected. "I haven't hidden anything. I knew it was only a matter of time before you'd find out." James stepped closer, his voice lower. "Then why? Why choose to work at my home? Why approach my daughter? What is it here that matters to you that much?" Chris looked directly into his eyes. There was no defiance there, no fear, only a kind of pain so deeply familiar. It had become silence itself. "I didn't come here for revenge, if that's what you're thinking. I never thought I'd meet another child who reminded me so much of Chloe." James clenched his hand. Chris continued. "Chloe was misdiagnosed. She didn't die of leukemia. She died because a doctor wanted to test an experimental treatment, unapproved, unregulated. They used her like a lab rat. By the time I found out, it was too late." A chill ran down James's spine. "Was the doctor's name Holden?" Chris nodded again, no surprise in his expression. "I saw his name in Emily's records. I know, this isn't just a coincidence." James stepped back. All the doubts he'd buried about how Dr. Holden had so quickly declared Emily's blindness permanent, how he'd shut down every possible intervention, suddenly began to snap together like jagged pieces of a nightmare puzzle. Chris took a deep breath. "I followed Holden from Boston to here. I know he worked for a private research lab, one regularly funded by pharmaceutical giants. Chloe wasn't the first child, and Emily might be one of the next." James felt dizzy. The world so logical, so controlled just moments ago, suddenly warped, like seen through shattered glass. "Why didn't you go to the police? File a lawsuit?" Chris let out a bitter laugh. "I tried, but he has protection. Lawyers, the media, medical boards. They all silenced me." "Then, what are you doing with my daughter? Investigating? Exposing him?" Chris shook his head. His voice softened. "I came close to Emily, because for the first time in years, I saw a child who didn't just need protection. She deserved to see the light again. And because I saw Chloe in her, not as a replacement, but as a promise I once failed to keep." The air between them thickened, as if the entire garden had stopped breathing. A soft breeze passed through, sending a few lavender petals to the ground. James turned away, gripping the back of a stone bench. Then he spoke, his voice pulled from deep within his chest. "I don't know who to trust anymore, Chris. I lost my wife. I almost lost my daughter. I can't let anyone, not even you, destroy what little I have left." Chris stood silently for a moment. Then he pulled a small envelope from his pocket. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to trust the truth." James took it. Inside was a copy of an independent optic nerve diagnostic report signed by Dr. Elena Marcia, top specialist in vision recovery. The report clearly stated Emily's condition was not irreparable. In fact, her optic nerves were still responsive to light stimuli. James looked up. For the first time, His eyes shimmered. Chris said quietly, "She can see again, but we have to act fast. Before Holden suspects you know." James clenched the report in his hand. Once again, the world he knew was changing. And this time, he would not stand on the sidelines. James sat silently at the kitchen table, his eyes fixed on a cup of cold coffee. The kitchen was spotless, gleaming, every surface meticulously designed to meet the highest standards, but he felt suffocated. Every object, every ticking second of the clock seemed alien in his mind. Next to him sat the envelope containing the diagnostic results from Dr. Elena Marcia, name he had never heard until Chris mentioned her. She was also the only person besides Chris who had offered him the first real sliver of hope in 2 years regarding his daughter's blindness. Emily might not be permanently blind. The MRI scans, pupil reflex tests, and neural responses all pointed to one thing. Her optic nerves were still active weak, but alive. This directly contradicted the conclusion of Dr. Holden, who had declared shortly after the accident that there was nothing left to save. James couldn't believe he had accepted that without question for 2 entire years. He'd been too shocked, too weighed down with guilt. He had put his faith in a reputable doctor without pressing for a second opinion. And now, that acceptance haunted him even more than the memory of the crash itself. Now, he needed certainty. Not feelings, not fragments of Chris's story. James needed undeniable truth, and he wasn't about to let anyone know he was investigating. 3 days later, James rented an unmarked SUV and personally drove Emily out of the estate under the pretense of a father-daughter getaway. Their destination, a private clinic in the suburbs of Stamford, Connecticut, where Dr. Marsh awaited them, having already reviewed Emily's full medical history. Emily lit up when she heard they'd be spending the day together. She sat calmly in the passenger seat, smiling as James told old stories about building forts together or their picnic at the base of the mountain. In those fleeting moments, James saw a flicker of the girl she had been before the world collapsed. And it hurt even more because he realized just how much time had been lost, time he could never recover. At the clinic, Emily was welcomed like a guest of honor. No noise, no cameras. Everything was quiet, deliberate, focused. Dr. Marsh was a woman in her early 50s, silver threads in her hair, a gentle voice, and eyes sharp as lasers. She asked Emily questions, not like a doctor talking to a patient, but like a person truly trying to understand a child. Then came the detailed tests, light response assessments, retinal scans, electrophysiological measurements. James waited outside for nearly 3 hours. He hadn't felt time pass this slowly since the night Anna died. At last, Dr. Marsh emerged. Her expression was neutral, but something in her eyes made James shoot to his feet. "We need to talk," she said. James followed her into a private room. The door closed. "I've reviewed all of Emily's previous records," Marsh began. Dr. Holden's conclusion was rushed. Not only did he skip critical testing, but some data points were altered or obscured. "Altered?" James echoed. "What do you mean?" Several visual reflex metrics, like light stimulation tests and optic nerve response, were either inaccurately recorded or deliberately modified. Worse, I found a data point labeled eSIM scan, which isn't part of any standard diagnostic protocol. I suspect it came from an unapproved experimental device not sanctioned by the FDA. James felt like someone had punched him in the chest. His eyes widened. "Can Emily see again?" he asked. Marsh nodded. Slowly, confidently. "I believe that with the right intervention, her right eye could recover up to 60–70% of normal vision. Her left eye is more challenging, but not impossible." James didn't speak. He just sat there, silent. Every emotion bottled up over the past 2 years. Guilt, anger, regret, hope burst forth in a long, trembling exhale. Emily could see the world again. But what had led Holden to declare otherwise? And worse, how many other children had he done this to? James and Emily left the clinic in the late afternoon. On the drive home, she tilted her head and asked, "Dad, why are you holding my hand so much today?" James squeezed her hand tighter but said nothing. He wasn't ready to tell her. Not yet. Not about the truth, not about what she had suffered, not just from the accident, but from a medical system that may have turned his daughter into an unwitting test subject. When they returned to the estate, Chris was waiting at the edge of the garden. James walked over. He didn't say a word, just handed him a copy of Dr. Marsh's report. Chris skimmed it. His expression didn't change until he reached the final line. James saw his lips tremble ever so slightly. A single tear slid down onto the page. Chris looked up at James not with defiance, not with expectation, but with the eyes of a man who'd just found an ally he never dared hope for. And James said just one sentence, "Now, I believe you." That night, James didn't sleep. He sat in the library, the soft amber light casting long shadows on the high ceiling above. On the table were 2 glasses of whiskey owned for him, one for the man sitting across from him, Chris Evans. Between them lay a map, several folders, color-printed photographs, and a laptop displaying a spreadsheet full of strange data. No more distance, no more suspicion, no more cold, suffocating silence that had lasted for 2 years. Now, there were only 2 father-son burdened by overwhelming guilt, the other scarred by unbearable loss bound by a common goal, justice for their daughters, and for dozens of other children. Chris was the first to speak. After Chloe died, I couldn't accept that it was just fate. Something was off from the beginning. Dr. Holden told me she had no hope. But the final vitals I kept of every one of them showed improvement. So why the sudden switch to experimental chemotherapy at the last minute? James stared at him, breathing slowly. He used them like test subjects? Chris nodded. I once accessed an internal file from a former colleague. It listed children labeled as potential candidates for Phase 1B clinical research. The terrifying part? Not a single parent on that list had signed a consent form, and every single case was directly overseen by Holden. James tapped the table, his eyes steel cold. If what you're saying is true, then he isn't just negligent. He's a criminal. Chris was quiet for a moment, then pulled a small USB drive from his backpack. This is something I didn't show you earlier. I needed to be sure you truly wanted to uncover everything. James took it, opened his laptop. The screen populated with dozens of files each bearing the name of a hospital, a patient, a timeline. Among them, Emily Whitaker, and another name, Zoe M. Chandler. James squinted. Zoe? Chris nodded. Zoe Chandler. She lost her vision after a minor head injury. Holden declared she'd be blind for life, but after being transferred to a new facility, her sight was almost fully restored. And her parents? Tried to sue. They were silenced, threatened, lost their jobs. Her hospital records conveniently disappeared. They had to move out of state. James leaned back, his hands over his face. He had once thought Emily's accident was the worst thing that could have happened, but now he understood worse than tragedy was a truth that had been buried, intentionally, systematically, by men in white coats with blood on their hands. Chris spoke slowly. I need you because you have what I don't power. Resources, the media. Most importantly, you're the only one who knows Holden misdiagnosed your daughter under your own roof. You need me for justice to have a fighting chance, James murmured. Not just a chance, Chris replied. To survive before it's silenced again. James stood and walked to the window. He looked out at the garden where Emily once laughed, touched the flowers, and said she wanted to see the world through Uncle Chris's eyes. Now he saw it clearly. If he didn't act, Emily would be the next name erased from the truth. He turned back, his voice calm but unwavering. Where do we start? Chris pulled out a large map marked with hospitals, where Holden had treated pediatric patients over the past 8 years. Each red dot marked a case of unexplained death, or treatment non-response. Over 30 were linked to clinical trials. James picked up his phone. He called Ethan Gray, his personal attorney and chief strategy advisor at Whitaker Holdings. Ethan, assemble the investigative team. I need surveillance on a man named Holden Financial History, wire transfers, pharma sponsorships, and every lawsuit he's ever quietly settled. Chris flinched slightly. You're planning to bring down the whole system? James looked at him, his gaze cold as the concrete walls he once built. If I must, I'll bring every brick of it down. Not just for Emily, but for Chloe, and every child whose parents didn't have the power to protect them. Chris said nothing, but for the first time in years, James saw something in his eyes. Hope real and burning. That night, they didn't sleep. James reassigned his entire digital forensics team to support Chris. A temporary data command center was set up in the mansion's basement, where cybersecurity experts began tracking every payment Holden had received, every internal email, every job change, every clinic relocation. The findings quickly revealed a powerful and deeply corrupted network. Holden was not working alone. He was backed by major sponsors, pharmaceutical companies who promised profit shares if he secured research quotas. Other doctors stayed silent in exchange for fame. James Swance, a man who built cities, was now planning to tear down an underground medical empire, one that had sacrificed innocent lives in the name of progress. The days that followed passed with an intensity James had never known. The mansion's basement had transformed into a covert operations center equipped with large monitors, digital maps, and confidential reports pouring in by the hour. Chris, once a top-tier engineer, now operated like a seasoned investigator. He meticulously reconstructed Dr. Holden's 10-year activity timeline, mapping out every hospital, each clinical trial, and all the suspicious financial ties unearthed from the data streams. James, on the other hand, activated his personal media network. He met with investigative journalists, medical attorneys, and former patients who had once been part of Holden's programs. He funded 3 families to file lawsuits, gradually dragging the truth out of the shadows. But they both knew, one misstep, and everything could collapse. On Monday morning, James took Emily to Dr. Elena Marsh's clinic to begin her vision recovery protocol. It was her first appointment since the reversal diagnosis. She wore a special pair of glasses designed to stimulate retinal cells. And then, the unexpected happened. Emily could see flashing lights. Trembling, she turned to James. "Daddy, am I really seeing something?" James couldn't hold back his tears. He gripped her hand and nodded. For the first time in 2 years, he wasn't just a provider, he was a father. But the moment didn't last long. That afternoon, a black car pulled up at the estate gate. 3 men in dark suits stepped out, no badges, no introductions. They asked to see James. One of them said flatly, "We're from the Federal Medical Council. There's information suggesting Mr. Whitaker is distributing unauthorized medical documents concerning a board-certified physician." James smiled coldly. "I'm distributing the truth, and if that's illegal, maybe the law itself is broken." They said nothing more, just handed him an envelope, a subpoena for a hearing. James knew then the system had begun to strike back. That night, his law firm's servers were hacked. Key documents vanished. Internal emails were leaked. A tabloid ran a headline accusing James Whitaker of exploiting his daughter's illness to manipulate public opinion. James slammed his fist on the desk. He knew this tactic too, well discredit the person to silence the truth. Chris, who had lost his own child because he lacked power, was now watching the same forces try to smother their fight all over again. But this time, they wouldn't retreat. Chris proposed a bold move. "We need to bring Emily into the light. A video. She tells her story not as a victim, but as a survivor." James hesitated. Emily had already been through so much. But later, when he sat down to talk to her, she gently took his hand and said, "If I can see again, I want people to know it's possible. If there's someone else like me, they won't give up." James nodded. A nod that came not from fear but from the heart of a father finally learning to listen to his child. 3 days later, the video went live on an independent channel. Emily's Light, the Untold Story. In it, Emily sat in the flower-filled garden, speaking softly. "Someone once told my dad that I would never see light again. But today, I see flowers. I see my dad's smile. And I see hope." The video exploded. Over 1 million views in 24 hours. Thousands of comments. Parents across the country shared stories of receiving similar diagnoses, of being pressured to give up. A movement was born. Ask again. Mainstream media picked up the story. But with it, the attacks escalated. One late evening, while James was in a meeting with his legal team in the library, Chris burst in pale and breathless. "Where's Emily?" James shot up. "In her room. With the nurse. Number. Her door's unlocked. She's not in the house. I checked the entire garden." A bolt of ice stabbed through James's chest. He ordered an immediate lockdown of the estate. Security activated the surveillance system. Guards swept the property. After 17 harrowing minutes, they found Emily standing near the back fence. A man had just fled the scene when security arrived. Emily trembled, unable to speak. Chris wrapped her in his arms, while James stood frozen. Outside, The war they faced was no longer just legal. It had become a bloodless warning from a desperate power clutching for control. That night, James didn't sleep. He stepped into his daughter's room, sat by her bed, and looked at the child he had once lost to darkness. Then, he gently kissed her forehead for the first time in 2 years and whispered, "You won't fight this alone anymore, I promise." James Whittaker had never feared going public. As the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire, he'd stood before angry shareholders, dissected by political watchdogs, and skewered by unforgiving press. But this time, it was different. This wasn't about protecting a company. It was about protecting the truth he had once trampled over, ignored, or quietly paid to make disappear. And now, he was ready to stake his name on this fight, not for glory, but for the tiny flicker of light in his daughter's eyes, just beginning to return. After the failed break-in at the estate, James decided to strike first. He called a press conference no traditional PR channels, no alerts to mainstream media. It was streamed live on Whittaker Group's independent platform beyond the reach of censors or corporate sabotage. Standing at the podium, before dozens of cameras and millions watching online, James stepped forward in a navy suit. His gaze was steady. His voice didn't waver once. "I used to believe justice was built through the system. I was wrong." He paused, eyes locked on the lens. "My daughter Emily was diagnosed as permanently blind, but after an independent evaluation, we found the opposite. Her vision has a chance to return. So why did Dr. Holdina man once celebrated declare otherwise from the very beginning? Why have dozens of similar medical records been buried?" Behind him, the screen displayed real scans, patient names, diagnosis dates, altered data points. "We have evidence that Holden partnered with pharmaceutical companies to conduct unauthorized clinical trials on children without proper family consent. These kids weren't patients. They were lab rats." A loud stir rippled through the crowd. James raised a hand holding a photocopied document stamped in red. "I've submitted this entire dossier to the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the World Health Organization. And I'm not just calling for investigation. I'm calling for prosecution." The moment the press conference ended, the media exploded. Every major outlet ran the speech. The hashtag number Justice for Emily climbed to the top of Twitter within 3 hours. Journalists who'd previously been blocked from the story now freely requested interviews. But as with any real war, the counterattack came swiftly. Within 48 hours, Whittaker Group stock dropped 11%. 3 major partners temporarily suspended collaboration, citing legal uncertainties. Tabloids began digging up old deals, painting James as a manipulative tycoon with a shady past. Emily was moved from the estate to live with her grandmother for safety. Chris began receiving anonymous threats no return address, just a single line. Chloe smiled once too. James understood immediately. They were striking at what mattered most through the oldest weapon of all, fear. But this time, he wouldn't retreat. Instead, he opened a new front, uniting those who had suffered like them. Chris proposed forming a coalition of families whose children had been victims of Holden. Within a week, they reached 14 families. Each had a different story: one child dead from unexplained renal failure, another paralyzed after a new therapy. Together, they signed a class action lawsuit set to become the largest medical case of the decade if accepted. On the day the case was filed in Manhattan District Court, media camped outside for 9 hours. James exited the building without comment, holding Emily's hand now, able to see the soft green of her dress. She smiled. James leaned in and whispered, "You can see now, can't you?" Emily nodded. "I see you fighting for me." That night, Chris entered the library carrying a new file. "I found the list of private donations Holden's received since 2013. And there's a name you'll recognize." James took the folder, opened the first page. His eyes narrowed. A familiar name. William R. Kessler, New York State Senator, board member of the National Medical Council, and a known opponent of clinical trial regulation bills. Chris said quietly, "He might be the reason Holden was never arrested." James stood still. He knew, in that moment, they had touched the heart of the beast, and from here on out, there would be no turning back. James Whittaker thought he had grown numb to shock. But the name William R. Kessler printed across the top of the file Chris handed him that day left him sitting in silence for nearly 10 minutes. Kessler wasn't just a longtime New York State Senator. He was also a senior advisor to the National Medical Oversight Council, the very organization that had honored Dr. Holden 5 years in a row for his advancements in pediatric treatment. Suddenly, it all made sense. Why were lawsuits against Holden consistently buried? Why did no media outlet dare touch the story? Why was Holden transferred so easily from one hospital to the next, always landing on his feet? The answer was in the cold numbers inside Chris's file. Over $3.8 million in personal donations, funneled through healthcare lobbying funds all traced back to Kessler's office. James realized this was no longer just about one family, or even a group of victims. This was war against a system rotting from the inside. A few days later, James flew to Washington, D.C. He requested a private meeting with Senator Kessler under the pretense of discussing public health care collaboration. The meeting lasted exactly 27 minutes, and it became one of the moments James would never forget. Kessler entered with a polished politician's grin, shook James's hand, and opened with a casual line. "James, I'm sorry about what happened to little Emily, but you and I both know medicine isn't always fair." James didn't smile. He placed a copy of the donation records on the table and slid them forward. "I didn't come here for your lecture on fairness. I came to give you a chance to walk away before this all goes up in flames." Kessler glanced down. His brow twitched slightly, but his face stayed composed. "You're playing with fire, James. I don't think you're ready to burn." James stood. "I'm not just ready. I brought the gasoline." Back in New York, James convened an emergency media strategy meeting. Within 24 hours, he released an audio clip of his entire conversation with Kessler, recorded legally under D.C. law. In the recording, Kessler didn't deny a thing. In fact, he said, "Without trials like these, we'll be 10 years behind China." The public erupted. The hashtag number Kessler cover-up dominated national headlines. A group of congresspeople filed a motion for an official investigation. An emergency press conference was scheduled the very next day. But the cost of that firepower soon became clear. That night, the Whitaker Group's auxiliary servers were hit with a cyber attack, 60% of their international project data wiped out. A surprise financial audit was launched by an independent firm quietly recommended years ago by Kessler's own office. Investment partners pulled out, and stock prices plummeted nearly 19% in just 3 days. But the blow that hit James hardest came with a midnight phone call. Chris had been attacked. Leaving a meeting with the victim families, his car was rammed from behind by a black SUV, sending it off the road. The other vehicle vanished without a trace. Chris survived with fractured ribs and a mild concussion. James rushed to the hospital that night. He sat beside Chris's bed, dim light falling across his pale face, his eyes wide open, not angry, just quiet. "They're afraid now," Chris said softly. "I won't let them touch my daughter," James growled. Chris gave a faint smile. "We both know this won't stop with us. If you want to finish this, you'll need more than money." James said nothing. He knew Chris was right. This fight could no longer be a two-man war. They needed community civil society, grassroots strength, and the voices of those who had been stepped on for too long. 3 days later, James organized a public forum, inviting every family who had ever been affected by Holden's actions. The hall was packed. On stage were James, Chris, and Emily, whose eyes could now recognize shapes. Beside her was Emma Wilson, a 7-year-old once diagnosed as blind, now slowly regaining sight. Before a sea of people, James spoke. "I once believed I was a strong man, until a construction worker taught me, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting any while you're still terrified." He held Emily's hand. She smiled gently, then stepped up to the microphone. "I want to see the garden again, and I want other kids to see their world too." The room burst into applause. That evening, James stood alone on the balcony. Cold wind swept through the gardened place where everything had begun. From behind, Chris stepped out, still bandaged. In his hand was a single piece of paper. "We just got word. A former resident doctor from Holden's hospital is ready to testify. And he has a hard drive with unpublished experimental data." James looked up at the pitch-black sky. For the first time in a long and brutal stretch of days, he whispered, "We might finally have real light." Chris nodded. "And this time, it won't be put out." The silver hard drive lay on the wooden desk in James Whitaker's library, small in size, but crushing in weight. It held the lives of hundreds. James said nothing for the first 10 minutes as his tech team began decrypting the files. The hard drive belonged to Dr. Alan Fraser, a former resident physician at Westminster Pediatric Center, where Dr. Holden had worked. Alan was the first to break the code of silence, tormented for years by what he had seen with his own eyes. In the email he sent to James, he wrote only one line: "I haven't been able to sleep. I saw the first child receive the wrong dosage, and I saw Holden shred the real files, replacing them with falsified ones. It's time the truth goes back to those who deserve it." The drive held 16 folders, each named after a hospital. Inside, hundreds of clinical reports, lab images, internal video recordings of treatment alignment meetings, and worst of all, an Excel spreadsheet titled Candidates Beta 1 B H, a list of 42 pediatric patients marked as potential test subjects. Emily Whitaker's name was on it. James froze when he saw his daughter's name, paired with the trial code, HH Trial, OC25A. Beneath it, condition: optic nerve damage, following traumatic brain injury. Projected treatment response: low. Note: family possesses strong financial assets. Can be leveraged as a PR case if successful. James felt the blood drain from his face. His daughter wasn't just misdiagnosed. She was marked as a potential pawn in a reputation-building scheme. Chris stepped beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. Chloe was on that list too. She was chosen. The room seemed to go silent, like oxygen had been pulled out of it. But there was no time for grief. James immediately ordered the tech team to duplicate the drive and send copies to 2 locations, the FBI and the New York Times, with one condition: exclusive publication, no alterations permitted. 2 days later, the U.S. media erupted. The New York Times released a special edition with a red-letter headline splashed across the front page. They knew, and they chose to hide. The article laid out every manipulated diagnosis, every falsified metric, every redirected grant that flowed through so-called research support networks. Internal video clips revealed Holden and his team discussing which child cases were more media-friendly. Not just Holden, but 3 department heads, 2 hospital executives, and a senior VP from pharmaceutical giant Biogenesis were caught on tape. The public reaction was seismic. The entire National Medical Board was called into internal review. 3 senior members resigned. Holden was arrested within the day. Social media drowned in outrage. One mother wrote, "My son died in 2020 from a strange treatment protocol. I always had doubts, but the doctor told me I was being too emotional. Turns out I was right. And my son died because they chose silence." Within 72 hours, over 30 families filed for reopened death investigations. Partner hospitals scrambled to hold press conferences and issue apologies. But the momentum didn't stop. Amid the chaos, Emily was invited to testify at an open congressional hearing. James didn't push her, but Emily, with a quiet conviction, nodded. That day, she stood behind a tall podium, her vision still blurry, but just clear enough to see shapes lightened her father, seated in the audience, quietly smiling. Emily spoke. "I lived for 2 years without seeing light. But worse, I lived 2 years where my dad couldn't look me in the eyes because he thought I'd never see again. But now I can. And I want others to see too, not just with their eyes, but with their hearts." The entire room fell silent. No applause, no whispers, just the stillness of a nation realizing there's something more terrifying than illness apathy wrapped in a white coat. Following the hearing, a wave of arrests began. Holden was indicted on 27 charges, including medical malpractice, evidence tampering, and negligent manslaughter. William R. Kessler was suspended from all duties, facing a federal probe into corruption and abuse of power. Biogenesis, the pharmaceutical giant behind much of the funding, lost 45% of its market value in a single week. As for James, he declined all interview requests. He issued only one statement: "I didn't act as a CEO, I acted as a father. And if that makes someone question their faith in corporations, then maybe it's time we rethink what's truly worth trusting." That night, Emily walked into the garden. Chris was tending the rose trellis. She moved slowly, but without needing anyone to guide her. "You know," she smiled, "I can see you now. Your curly hair. And the dirt on your shirt." Chris turned, his voice thick. "And I saw the light in you from day one." James stood in the doorway, watching Theman, who had lost a child. The other who had nearly lost her sight now finding each other again, like father and daughter. He didn't step forward. He didn't need to, because he knew. He, too, had finally begun to see again the part of himself that had long been lost in the dark. 2 months after Dr. Holden's arrest, the Whitaker estate echoed with the sound of hammers, stone saws, laughter, and children playing. But James wasn't building a new headquarters for Whitaker Group. He and Chris were building the Zoe Foundation, named after Chris's late daughter. Located on the outskirts of northern New York, the site had once been an abandoned farm. Now it was being transformed into a multidisciplinary rehabilitation center for children who had been misdiagnosed or psychologically scarred by unethical medical treatment. James personally invested over $28 million not from the company's fund, not for PR philanthropy. He wanted this place to be truly safe, truly human. Chris oversaw the construction himself, no contractors. "I left architecture because it felt meaningless," he said. "Now I know. I need to build again, brick by brick for the children who still have a chance." The main facility was U-shaped, designed to be open and airy, wrapped around a central garden. In the middle stood a cherry blossom tree planted by Emily with her own hands. When asked why, she smiled and said, "My mom once told me, cherry blossoms bloom the most beautifully after the coldest winters." The opening day of the Zoe Foundation was cloudy, but the rain held off. On an outdoor stage, James stood in a simple gray suit, no logos, no prepared speech. He looked out over the crowd, Emily, Chris, Emily's grandmother, the children saved by the investigation, and hundreds who had once been silent victims of a broken system. He spoke, "We didn't build this place to replace hospitals. We built it to remind the world that healing doesn't require deception. Recovery doesn't have to cost someone's conscience." Applause erupted. Then he called one woman to the stage, Dr. Elena Marsh, the ophthalmologist who had dared to challenge Emily's original diagnosis, who had turned down fortune to protect a child, was now appointed the foundation's chief medical officer. She stepped forward and said plainly, "We won't promise to fix everything, but we will promise never to turn patients into experiments. Here, children will be seen and heard." Zoe Foundation quickly gained media attention not because of scandal, but because of its staggering success. In just 6 weeks, 15 cases showed exceptional recovery, including 3 once deemed beyond treatment. A girl paralyzed after a misinjected drug at a private clinic stood on crutches after 2 months of therapy here. Emma Wilson, 7-year-old girl Emily had mentioned in her testimony, was now attending regular school after receiving non-chemical-based treatments. Chris led a new sensory therapy program where children interacted with nature and real-world materials. The technique, which he had developed informally while playing with Emily, was now dubbed tactile healing, a model recognized for its effectiveness in restoring sensory and emotional functions. But the Foundation's greatest triumph wasn't technical. It was in a quiet detail, impossible to forget. In the main hall, on an oak-paneled wall, hung a single bronze plaque. No sponsor logos, no founder names, just one line, "For Zoe, who taught us that not everyone who loses light is blind, and not everyone who sees can truly see." Every day, children entering the center placed their hands on that plaque. If whispering something sacred, a ritual small but deeply meaningful. One afternoon, James stood watching the children playing tag around the cherry tree. Chris stepped beside him, silent for a few minutes. Then James asked, "Do you think Zoe would be proud?" Chris didn't answer right away. He gazed at the swaying swings, at a girl practicing her steps with a walker, at Emily laughing with Emma. Then he said, "I don't think Zoe cared about pride. I think she just wanted other kids to live fully." James nodded, eyes misting. Chris added, "And I think we're no longer men ruled by our pasts." James turned, gently placing a hand on Chris's shoulder. We're men who know how to rebuild. From ashes. That night, James visited Emily's room. She was reading Braille beneath the soft glow of her bedside lamp. Her brown hair shimmered as she looked up. "Can't sleep?" he asked. Emily shook her head. "I'm rereading my favorite part." "Which one is that?" She traced her fingers over the raised letters, then read aloud, "When you're lost in the forest, follow the light. Even if it's just a flicker, it's still hope." James leaned down and kissed her forehead, and in that moment, he knew Every wound, every loss, every war had led him back here, where the light at last had returned. One morning in June, James Whittaker received an international call. On the other end was a representative from the World Health Organization. "Mr. Whittaker, we're deeply impressed by the treatment model at the Zoe Foundation. We're considering replicating it at community medical centers in Poland, Kenya, and India. If possible, we'd like you to join us in Geneva to discuss a global strategy." James posed. 2 years ago, this invitation would have thrilled him. But now, he simply looked out the window where Emily sat reading Braille with other children in the garden. Her hair floated gently in the breeze. Her fingers traced each line, and her smile needed no translation. James replied quietly, "I'll consider it. But whether or not I come, the Zoe Foundation will always be here. And we're ready to share everything." Less than 6 months after its opening, the Zoe Foundation had become a phenomenon. Not because of advertising, not because of a branding campaign, but because it worked and because each child healed carried a story the world couldn't ignore. Other health centers began sending professionals to learn from them. Politicians who once ignored the foundation now awkwardly requested photo ops. One major paper called it a medical revolution that began in the garden of a man who once ran away from his own daughter. James didn't care. He turned down 7 interview requests, 3 book deals, and 2 subtle nudges to run for state governor. The only thing that mattered to him now was waking up each morning knowing Emily could truly see the new day. One afternoon, as James was reviewing internal reports at the center, Ethan Gray, his former financial advisor at Whittaker Group, stopped by. He wasn't in a suit. No briefcase. Just an iPad in hand. "James, I know you've stepped back, but the board's approaching a crisis. The largest shareholder just called for an emergency assembly. They want you back. The company's drifting." James said nothing. Ethan continued, "They don't need a CEO with a cause. They need someone to bring the numbers back on track." James looked at him calmly. "I used to think I was born to lead, but now I realize I'm just someone who had to learn how to be a father." Ethan placed the iPad on the table. On it, a plummeting stock graph. Below it, Whittaker Group. Executive decision required within 72 hours. Then he left no pressure, no demands. That night, James sat alone in Zoe Foundation's archive room. A small space, lined with photos of children who had been treated at the center. Under each photo, a note, a handwritten message, a piece of memory. He stopped at one photo of Emma Wilson, the little girl who'd lost hope after a misdiagnosis, now painting her first watercolor piece. Beneath it, in messy handwriting, "Thank you for believing my eyes could see. But more than that, thank you for believing my heart could dream." James sat on a wooden bench, and for the first time he wept not from grief, but because he had found something long lost: faith. The next morning, he arrived early at Zoe's office. He wore an olive sweater, khaki pants, and old leather shoes, no longer the image of a CEO. Chris was making coffee in the small kitchen. When he saw James, he asked, "Didn't sleep?" James smiled softly. "Slept a bit. Woke up in the middle of the night and reread that letter from Chloe you gave me." Chris was silent. Then James handed him an envelope. "I'm officially declining the executive role at Whittaker Group. I've transferred power to Ethan, reduced my shares to maintain Zoe's independence." Chris looked at him, warmth in his eyes. "So you're choosing to rebuild from scratch?" James nodded. "I'm choosing to stay where I don't need to explain who I am. I just need to do what I know is right." News of James Whittaker's resignation spread like wildfire. The press dubbed it the most unexpected farewell of the decade. Shareholders were furious. Markets trembled. But within weeks, Whittaker Group restructured following the blueprint James left behind, mandating at least 30% of annual profits be reinvested into public health care. No one expected James to return, and they were right. One late summer afternoon, Emily played piano on the porcher, eyes now clearly able to track every key. James sat beside her, reading. Chris approached, holding an international newspaper. "Zoe Foundation's been invited to open a center in Kenya." James looked up. "Do you want to go?" Chris smiled. "If you'll come with me." James glanced at Emily, who smiled at them after finishing a gentle melody. He nodded. "All right, but we bring the garden too. Sometimes, life must fall apart to teach us how to live again." James Whittaker was no longer the man who feared looking his daughter in the eyes. He was now the man leading hundreds of children out of the dark, carrying the light he relearned from a bricklayer and a daughter who dared to dream. The 7th of August. The garden of the Zoe Foundation was adorned with purple ribbons, soft pink balloons, and hand-drawn paintings strung like a children's art gallery. It was Emily's 11th birthday. A day that 2 years ago, no one could guarantee would ever arrive. A day James once feared, if it came at all, would be cloaked in darkness and sorrow. But today, the sunlight poured down gently. A soft breeze danced through the children's hair. Laughter echoed across the garden. And Emily, in a white dress light as a cloud, sat before a large birthday cake shaped like a cherry blossom tree. "I want the cherry tree on the cake," Emily had said, "because that's the first place I ever saw a petal again." She closed her eyes, made a wish, then opened them. Her brown eyes shimmered not just with sunlight, but with the light that now lived inside her. Everyone clapped. James stood a few steps back, watching his daughter, not moving forward, not saying anything, just letting his heart fill completely. There were no dignitaries, no television cameras, no prepared speeches. Only children, many of whom had nearly never seen the world now, painting, laughing, chasing each other, and debating things like whether grass green looks different than mint green. Emma Wilson ran up and tugged Emily's hand. "Guess what? I saw my face in the mirror today," my mom cried. But like happy tears. Emily hugged her tightly. James turned to see Chris not far away, helping a deaf boy sculpt clay. He looked up, their eyes met, and they exchanged a simple nod. Nothing needed to be said. Everything had already been understood. After the party, everyone gathered beneath the large cherry tree in the center of the garden, the one Emily and Chris had planted in the first week the Zoe Foundation opened. Emily stepped onto a small platform, holding a wireless microphone. "I know today is my birthday, but I don't want to be the one getting gifts. I want to give them." Everyone chuckled. She pointed to a large green box nearby. "Inside are 14 paintings. Each one is a moment I remember from when I started to see again. I painted them from memory and with love. I want to give one to every doctor, teacher, and friend here." Then her voice softened. "And there's one special painting I want to give to my dad." James stepped forward. All eyes followed him, the man once known as the unbreakable steel of Wall Street, now walking slowly, as if afraid to break the moment itself. Emily handed him a painting. It wasn't perfect, but it was unmistakable. It was James sitting by the window, holding Emily's hand, sunlight streaming across them both. In the bottom right corner, in wobbly handwriting, "The first time Dad and I looked the same way. The first time I really saw him." James hugged his daughter. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His tears fell freely, not tears of guilt anymore, but of rebirth, of a man brought back to life by his own child. That evening, in his office at the Zoe Foundation, Chris pulled out an old, weathered leather notebook, his journal from the lonely years after Chloe passed. He handed it to James. "I used to write in this every day after she was gone." One entry said, "I wish there were a place where Chloe could live on, not just in memory, but in the laughter of other children. I think I've found that place." James held the notebook, placed his hand over the cover. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He had his own journal, now not written in ink, but in moments, like a little girl painting light, like a man learning how to be a father again, like a cherry tree blooming after the longest winter of their lives. The next morning, during a small board meeting at the foundation, James spoke up. "I want to start a new branch, Zoe Global. Not just medical recovery, but ethical education. A program to retrain doctors not only in skill, but in compassion." Dr. Elena Marsh, Chief Medical Director, nodded. "It's time we remind the world. Patients are not case files. They're people with dreams, fears, and families." Chris smiled. "And sometimes all it takes is someone who still believes there's light left in their eyes." That same day, in a quiet corner of the garden, Emily wrote a letter by hand. It was addressed, "To the one who comes here after me, who may not see yet, but can still feel everything." In it, she wrote, "If you're reading this, maybe you feel like I once did, that there's nothing left to see. But you know what? Some of the most beautiful things don't need eyes to see. They need patience, a soft touch, the faith of someone who won't give up on you. Like my dad. Like Uncle Chris. Like Dr. Marsh. Like you." The letter was placed inside a small wooden box beneath the cherry tree, where every new child at the Zoe Foundation is led on their first day. That's where everything begins. And sometimes, where everything finally finds its way home. None of us begins life with all the answers. We stumble, we lose, and more than once, we lose our way. James Whittaker once believed he had it all: power, wealth, acclaim. But what he didn't see was that he was losing the most precious thing of all: the ability to truly see the person right in front of him. Chris Evans, a man crushed by the loss of his wife and daughter, with seemingly nothing left to hope for, chose to rise again. Not for revenge, but to make sure it wouldn't happen to someone else. And Emily, the little girl who lived 2 years in darkness, taught both of them a lesson no textbook could ever explain: that sometimes seeing a person is more important than seeing the whole world. The Zoe Foundation wasn't built from steel and glass. It was built from invisible tears, unspoken apologies, and small hopes that had once been buried deep. And yet, the truth found a way through. And light, however faint, was enough to lead them back to themselves. If you've watched this far, maybe you've been lost, too. Maybe you've lost someone, or maybe you've lost yourself. But remember, like Emily once wrote, light doesn't come from the eyes. It comes from the place where someone puts their hand on your shoulder and says, "I believe you still see." And sometimes, everything begins with just one person who doesn't walk away. Thank you for watching to the end. If this story touched you, leave a comment below. For the fathers who once stayed silent, for the children who were once forgotten, and for anyone still searching for light in their life, you're not alone. We've all been lost before, but here in this story, we've found our way back to each other.